Good afternoon, everybody. Dies Marie Galer in my native Irish language. Hello to everybody, and particularly to all of those who are joining us online. You're welcome to this session, where we are going to look at the barriers to women's participation in public life and overcoming those barriers. And of course, the overall session is about building trust and reinforcing democracy, and you cannot build trust and you cannot reinforce democracy if you ignore half the population. As we say so often, it takes more than one person to hold up the roof. So I would just ask each of you, no matter where you are, just to one simple question. Did you all look at the photograph of the world leaders at the COP27, and did you see all the women? And did you all look really, really closely to see where the women were, if there were any women? Because I'm afraid you would have had to look very closely. We could have looked at the G20 photograph, except they didn't take a G20 photograph last week. So I think, unfortunately, as we look at these large family photographs, we are not represented. Don't worry, I am not here as an Irish person to tell you how wonderful we are. Only 22% of our parliament is female, but I am mayor of my county, which elected 50% male-female. So we're pretty proud of that one, you know. So, but of course, it's not the women in the photographs who are capturing the headlines, but I think you will agree that it's a lot of women around the world who have captured the headlines, young and older. Look at Greta. Look at Malala, look at Masha. So whether it is in environment or education or human rights, women have been very much to the fore. Look at the women of Ukraine, who with great dignity and courage are taking their children and moving to safe havens where they can get their children educated. Look at the women of Afghanistan, who continue to suffer so much. Look at the women, the young women in Mali, in the armed forces, who are the ones who are trying to bring about peace. But as one of our Nobel laureate Irish poets says, W.B. Yeats, peace comes dropping slow. So here we want to ensure throughout all of the OECD members and beyond that voice, that women's voice is heard, as it was, for example, in the peace process in Northern Ireland of the Women's Coalition. So all of our documents say we should have women, all of our processes said we should have equality, etc. But our established democracies are not exactly, as I said, very representative. I have been doing some work with the OECD and the governance programme and MENA and Tatiana for a number of years, and we looked at the barriers, and they were the same mostly. You could call them different things around the world, but they were childcare and culture and cash and confidence and the community involvement, and they were all, in Ireland we called them the C's, the barriers to political participation. And now there are new barriers. There's cyberbullying, and there's abuse, and there's the effect of the new world and the new technologies. So I now think instead of the 5 C's, you could probably go through the whole alphabet and find barriers to women's participation. A is for abuse, and B is for bullying, and C is for cyber, and D is for disinformation, and E is for economic disadvantage, right down to. But we don't want to be negative about it, because we have a wonderful panel, a hugely international panel here today from a wide range of experiences, and I'm so honoured to have them all with me. And just in one line, I'm going to tell you who they are, and please do look up their whole biographies on your notes. Minister Bjarni Benediktsson from Iceland, thank you for joining us. Maya Morsi, who's joining us virtually from Egypt, particularly glad to have you there, thank you. Nicole Manz-Bazoui from the USA, who is looking at the whole economic side of it. Silvana Rochmerwin, women political leaders from her experience of the European Parliament. We have Paulina Ibarra from the Fundación Multitude, and we have Lucina Di Mecco from She Persisted. So we have civil society, political society, the economic perspective, we have it all tied together here. So enough talking from me, let's hear what our wonderful panel have to say. And over 2 different questions, with of course time for our audience here present. The first round of questions is about understanding the barriers to women's participation in public life. So I've rolled off a few of them there. But I'm going to start, if I may, with Minister Bjarni Benediktsson, because Iceland counts as one of the highest shares of women in Parliament across the OECD. Your women participation is at 48%. And 40% of ministerial positions, which is really very high compared to some of us, as I've just said. So maybe you could outline for us what are the success factors in these figures and what is being done to achieve this gender balance in the Parliament and in the Cabinet in your country, please.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. Now, I think to start with, I have to say that it's been a long journey. You know, it's, a few years back we celebrated a century since women got the right to vote. This year, in July, we celebrated 100 years since the first woman came into Parliament. And she wrote in 1930 that for the first women participating in Parliament, it is going to be very difficult. But as they grow in number, it will be less difficult for them only for being women in politics. And since then, we've had, we live in a society which has a strong democratic tradition. We've had a lot of very strong role models that have played a big part, such as the first elected president woman in the world, Vigdís Finnbogadóttir. We had in the 80s, we had women's political movement, which highlighted the gender issues. And we've slowly, through a democratic process and a dialogue in society, lifted awareness of the necessity of women not only participating in politics, but generally in society. And this has led to a situation where we have the highest women participation in the workforce, but also have a very high participation in politics at the moment compared to others. But let me make one thing clear, we don't feel we've, still succeeded fully. There is still a lot to be done. So I think the strong democratic tradition has played a part. Those very strong role models have played a part, and also the political parties have taken it upon themselves to do something about it. And that has to do with both internal processes, such as how you go through pre-elections. And I can say for myself, I made an effort to have the party and my parliamentary group understand that it was important that we appointed young women leaders into, for example, ministerial positions. And that was supported and accepted. So I, for example, have appointed 2 out of the youngest ministers, women ministers, in our democratic history. So I think it is, it does take time. You need to have a very active democratic dialogue, and of course, passing the necessary legal, let's say, steps has also played a big role. And one of the things that has played a big part in that sense in Iceland through the legal process is the paternity leave and the access to daycare. And we have non-transferable paternal leave rights for both parents. So this, of course, means that if one of the parents does not use the paternal leave, it will just fall down and will not be used, which has created a situation where it becomes obvious that you need to use it, and that has increased tremendously men's participation in taking paternal leave in the 12 months that we have now legalized. Now, I could go on talking about other laws that we have passed, such as equal pay, general gender laws, to make sure that when we appoint in positions, we take into account the different positions of the genders, and other issues. But I think the paternal leave law was a big step, and we're still developing that and have increased rights for both parents. So those are a few points: the strong leaders, the strong democratic history and tradition we do have, the fact that politics have taken it upon themselves to do something about it and do it actively, and then we've passed some very important legislation.
Thank you very much, Minister. You certainly have hit on a number of very key important points for all of us, not just Iceland, so thank you for that. If I may turn to Maya in Egypt. Dr. Maya Morsi is the President of the National Council of Women. Lovely to see you. Thank you for being with us, as I said. And Egypt has made very important strides over the last few years, even since we visited on a country visit from OECD. And the 2020 elections look very significant for women, where 27% of the House of Representatives and now 13.3% of the Senate is made up of women. So can you explain for us this evolution and the main challenges that they still have to face in Egypt?
It's a pleasure to be with you, and unfortunately I'm far away. I'm in Egypt still for the COP27. But I really admired your talk about how we don't want to enter into the whole alphabet regarding challenges and barriers coming and facing women at large in political and decision-making sphere. Yes, we had a lot of frog leaps regarding women participation, and it's by constitution. We had the 25% in the parliament, 25% in the law, and this is constitution, so it's protected somehow. Although women had increased, even with the quota in the representation, 28% reached to the parliament and 14% into the Senate. A lot of breaking the glass ceiling or shattering the iron walls, reaching out to other decision-making positions and political as well, like advisor to the president on national security, positions of governors that were not ever given to women, presidents of economic courts, deputy governors of central banks, and higher-level decision-makers through the Human Rights Council. But the main challenges that still women are facing, and I think it's ideational setup, it's the community perception of them reaching to this stage, status. And especially in parliaments and political life and decision making, this is something that needs generation. Mindset, girl also focusing on role models. But what we are facing at this moment is something that it's not Egypt alone can move towards, or any country alone. It's a holistic approach, and it's cyberbullying and cyber crimes, actually. Or let me put it in a different word, hate speech on the cyberspace. And there are several studies that I think also the IPU had addressed that almost senior female politicians are more than 3 times are likely to experience comments on their Twitter, on their Facebook, rather than their male counterparts. And this is in worldwide and in several countries. So online violence against women in politics, coming from aggression, coercion, intimidation, is really pushing or trying to make it appear that excluding women from politics or high-level positions simply because they are women, or sending messages that women should not be involved in politics or public life. And earlier, I remember in 2011, we were saying that the safe space for women in politics would be the cyberspace. And at this moment, it's making women intimidated, and social platforms actually are not controlled or not does not have the power of the governments or the legislations within the governments. It's something beyond our
Unfortunately, I don't know if you can hear us, Moya. Your microphone has frozen. Okay, we'll move on because we will come back to you. If you can hear us
again. Can you hear me again?
We can hear you, but we can't see you. If you want to keep going and complete what you're saying, that's good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
So
we can see you again now.
social media platforms have an intermediary liability and policies to protect women from defamation, abuse, private life interference, hatred crimes, hatred speech directed towards women only, just because they are women in leadership positions, and are all factors that I personally consider resistance to all efforts that any national government or national women machinery can do. So you were seeing cyberbullying, as you have said, and the misconception of gender roles, social roles, and stereotyping is pushing and crucial in this context. So people are expecting and waiting for her to fail, for her to be blocked, or once a woman has a leading position, she becomes the center of attention and also the center of attacks. So as a woman leader, the possibility of becoming a victim of various crimes is increasing once you're reaching a political decision-making position or as a politician. So there is an invasion of privacy or violation, bullying, discrimination, defamation, hatred speech and crimes, even threats of death sometimes because you are lobbying or entering into a certain lobbying space, let me put it this way. So cyber crimes have the easy choice, the perpetrators on the cyberspace being anonymous. So they are protected, but I am not protected. Anonymous to their victims and to the law enforcement authorities, and enjoy a high sense of impunity, actually, because knowing them and their anonymity is secured. So the power of social media must be considered, and especially in the public life of women decision-making. There are international laws that are not tackling this issue. There not a single convention or an international frame that would protect us on the cyberspace. So the power of social media must be considered as a major threat if policies are not implemented to protect the women in decision-making.
Thank you very much indeed, Maya.
We have to start.
I was going to say, if I can hold
a call or something that women in policy making should be protected from this unsafe space, and it should be maybe that if there are conventions related to cyber crimes, we have to have something regarding protection in this space, or if there is some, I know that there is something that is prepared.
Okay, Mike, thank you so much for that. I think we got the main point of the invasion of privacy and the hate speech, etc. So thank you for that. Hopefully we will be able to reconnect with you.
Online.
Okay, I'm going to move on, if I may, to something completely different, all equally important, to Nicole, who's our Senior Economic Policy Advisor and Director for Women's Economic Empowerment with the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues in the United States of America. So, Nicole, obviously, women's participation is hindered in some ways, as we know, by the whole work-life balance challenge and the lack of family-friendly measures. They're the frequent barriers that are raised in every country when we're talking about it. And I'm just wondering, from the economist's perspective, how can investment in care infrastructure contribute to fostering women's participation in public life? Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the OECD for addressing this very, very important issue. As we all know, no country has achieved gender equality, even my own, at least not yet. Right? We're working on it. At the 65th United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, Vice President Harris, yes, Madam Vice President, really summarized well the issues we're here to discuss today when she said, the status of women is the status of democracy. And this is, I think, something that is just so important to foot stomp in this situation. The COVID pandemic, as we know, uniquely impacted women and girls around the globe, as women and girls are disproportionately called upon to provide care responsibilities in the home, whether it is children that were pulled out of school, caring for the sick, the disabled, or the elderly. This very much falls on women and girls. Women were forced to withdraw from the workplace. And as you noted, work-life balance challenges and the lack of family-friendly measures are among the most frequent barriers impeding women from being elected and participating or remaining in national politics as well. So what can we do about it, right? We've identified the issue. What can we do about it? Well, this past June, President Biden announced the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, what we call PGII, which recognizes the critical need for partnerships across governments, private sector, and broader society to strengthen foundational aspects to our global economy. The PGII initiative prioritizes 4 key sectors, including health, technology, climate and energy, and gender equity and equality. One example of how we are employing PGII is through our investment in the World Bank's Invest in Childcare. We recognize that a robust and equitable care economy is a critical factor in advancing women's empowerment, economic security, and political participation, and we will work to develop care infrastructure around the world. This will require a global effort to invest in advocacy for legal and policy reforms in the care economy, to recognize, reduce, and redistribute unpaid care labor, reward paid care work, enable and increase access to care infrastructure, including childcare, and guarantee care workers' labor rights, their protections, and increased representation. These investments are crucial to furthering our work to promote gender equity and equality, which is foundational to the prosperity, stability, and security of all people around the world. We're also working to amplify data on the positive impacts of flexible work-life balance programs, telework, and quality care options for working families, so we can have data-informed policy-making, policy decision-making, and programming. Gender equality and the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women and girls in decision-making is key to sustainably healthy democracies and promoting stability. The United States stands firm in its commitment to partnering with girls and young women in all their diversity and to uplift their voices in securing equal employment of their rights, safety, and ability to meaningfully participate in societies and decision-making. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Just one very quick question from me. Does your care strategy, as it were, include care of older people as well as care of children? Because I find women were the ones who were called upon at both ends.
That's right, and we have done, actually we had a person in our office do a specific study on the needs of elder care around the world, because we do realize that it's not just about child care, the sick and the disabled, but there is an aging population in many countries.
And it's the women who end up looking after them. So wonderful, thank you so much. Completely different perspective. Silvana has great experience as a former member of the European Parliament and as Vice President for many years, and of course as founder of the Women Political Leaders. You're well versed in the whole women's representation. So can I just ask you again, as we look at this session, at the main obstacles to leadership positions within political parties and elected office?
Thank you, Mary, for this kind introduction. And it's a hugely important issue, of course, for us, knowing that there is hardly any country in the world that says you're a woman, you're not allowed to run. You're not allowed to run for higher office. But then when we look at it, according to UN Women, around 93% of the world's presidents, prime ministers are men. 3/4 of the parliamentarians are men. So what's happening? And we're celebrating, of course, every time a woman gets elected to be prime minister or president, and probably most of us in this room can probably list the countries that currently have a woman in this position, which shows the extent of the problem. Because the challenge is not necessarily to be the first. The challenge is, where's the second, where's the third? When does it become normal that there is a woman? And shattering the glass ceiling, yes, it's an important first step. But what comes then is the realization that behind this glass ceiling, there's actually a massive concrete block. And that's the challenge. And the challenge is, and that's what Maya also mentioned before, and we're talking about trust in democracies and how to rebuild this trust. Trust is an emotion. Trust is something that is difficult to measure. And who do you trust to be your leader? Who do you trust to be taking the right decisions on your behalf? Most women leaders have their own personal stories about how they were undermined, how they were marginalized, sexist behavior, and so on, which shows that women aren't treated the same way when they're in leadership positions. So 5 years ago, women political leaders embarked on the journey to do with Kantar Public a measuring of the stereotypes on what do you think makes a suitable leader, the extent to what is the prejudice towards women or men for a leadership position across 23 sectors, not only politics. And it's the G20 countries plus a few others, including Iceland, that we're measuring. No surprise, Iceland comes out the champion, well deserved. But in all countries, the trust in women as political leaders is way lower than in men. And this is kind of opposite to the outcome, the quality of political decision making currently, because we all know the state of the world, and that new leadership would be requested. And what's interesting that over the past 5 years, there's been hardly any progress, which shows that those stereotypes are sticky, are long-lasting, and are very much ingrained, and need kind of a lot of persistent working on. And what's also interesting is that in most countries, the prejudice that men hold towards women in leadership position, political leadership position, are bigger than the prejudices that women hold. However, there's not that much of a difference. We can't say that in general women are more supportive of women. They're a small bit more supportive than women. And this even goes for Iceland, where 100 would mean it doesn't matter if you're man or woman, what matters is how capable you are. In Iceland, for example, more than 90 in this 100 figure of women say, I'm very comfortable with having a woman as a leader, and more than 80 of men say that they're very comfortable, which is, again, exponentially higher than in all other countries. So what does this really mean? I think it's crucial to have those very visible role models. The sentence, "you can be what you can see," is really important in political representation, to have different kind of personalities that also speak to different groups of voters, so that there is the normality of whatever size, age, of woman running, as the same normality applies to men, so that there is no this differentiation. It also means, what are we discussing when we talk about women? In our index, the US was doing pretty well, but in the last year, the drop in perception for suitability for leadership of women was really significant. And what we heard from Kantar is that the discussion about the uterus of women, are women allowed to decide what's happening with their own body, really moved the discussion away, are women capable leaders? Because if you question a woman being able to decide over her own body, can she then move on and take other decisions? This is kind of an unconscious correlation of what's the perception. So, but role models, what kind of discourse do we have around women? And then finally, and again, Iceland is really leading the way, moving away from having specific women's issues, making societal issues. The parental leave one, for example. But also in Iceland, gender issues are a top-down job, meaning it's part of the Prime Minister's portfolio. And every policy is gender mainstreamed, is looked at from a gender lens. Spain is doing the same, and they're increasing tremendously, both in the gender gap report as well as in the measurements of perceptions. So just a few points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Silvana. Bjarni, it sounds like you have a fan in Silvana. Yeah. Well done. Okay, I'm going to move on to Paulina Ibarra. And Paulina is the Executive Director of what's called Fundación Multitude. And I just want to ask you about the threat of the spread of mis- and disinformation. And we've had a discussion on this morning, but it's a threat to the whole democratic process, but specifically maybe you could address how it affects women. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Thank you to the OECD for inviting me to be here today and to the people online. This information is actually a form of online gender-based violence, and we forget that quite often. And it's real, and it discourages and delegitimizes the participation of women in politics. And it's being used to exclude women and gender diverse, representing vulnerable groups from participating in democracy. The intention is clear: humiliating women and girls and exposing them to public scrutiny. So the question of how we are differently affected has a very clear answer. Unlike our male counterparts, we face barriers designed to keep us out of public life by questioning our capacity to hold public office and participate of democratic processes, questioning, again, our capacity, reinforcing sexist, pre-existing beliefs, stereotypes, and tropes. And there is a difference in the manner that mis- and disinformation target women and men. Women are not only disproportionately targeted, but the attacks are about our character over policies. And of course, these patterns are even more pronounced for women from racial, ethnic, religious, and other minority groups. Today, we see coordinated cross-border disinformation movements led by big groups of interest against high-profile women in key public positions that are actually proposing very disruptive reforms. We saw it, for example, with Vice President Harris during the 2020 elections, and with Elisa Loncón, former president of the Constitutional Convention in Chile. VP Harris was accused of even not being African American, and Elisa Loncón of meeting former dictator Pinochet and swimming naked after one convention constitutional event. In the multiple research that Fundación Multitudes has carried out, we clearly see the impact of disinformation on women's political participation. Last year, Chilean parliamentarians and members of the Constitutional Convention answered our survey on disinformation with astonishing results. 94% of the women parliamentarians and 62% of members of the Constitutional Convention said that they had been victims of disinformation as a form of online gender political violence. In addition, the women surveyed suffered a higher percentage of disinformation attacks about their work in the conventional constitution, actually 69% versus 47% of men, and almost all of them normalized the ill relation between politics and violence. In the same research, we found that 67% of disinformation campaigns were actually directed at women and only 33% at men. In addition, 39% of the affected members were representative of indigenous populations communities. In our report, we found that women from regional populations were 5 times more likely to become victims of disinformation as a form of online gender-based violence. And to understand the impact of women entering politics, we recently conducted an exploratory survey among Chilean activists where 56% of them said that the potential of becoming victims of gender political disinformation would be a factor to withdraw from activism or thinking of becoming a candidate for public office. Finally, also disinformation campaigns targeting women and happening during the electoral process make more evident the dark box effect in social media caused by the outdated electoral laws that leave a loophole that allows paid advertising by political organizations and private interest groups to freely disseminate false and misleading content that publicly humiliate and harass women and gender diverse people in order to force them out of political race or severely affect their position in the preference of voting. And unfortunately, this is especially true in the Global South.
Thank you so much. It's very useful to have the research which backs up which any of us in public life could tell you. But it's important to have those statistics. A newly elected member of Parliament in my own area, a young mother, was subjected to vile abuse, sexual videos being posted with her image being used on sites. But in fairness to our Garda Síochána, they arrested him. He was taken to court, but she was courageous enough to go to the court to give her evidence and to say how it affected her. And I think that will help a lot of women, because a lot of women wouldn't have that courage and wouldn't want her child in the future to know that she had been subjected to this. So it takes a lot to overcome it. And I think that feeds in directly into Lucina, who is our expert on many things. She persisted, but I know you're very good on the digital technologies and cyber violence and that. And maybe could you tell us how it can hold women back, this whole online hate, please?
Thank you Yes, I co-founded She Persisted 2 years ago because I was really fed up of hearing story after story after story looking very much like what you just shared. And so I interviewed dozens of women all over the world and kept hearing that they were really targeted with vicious, overwhelming amounts of online abuse, threats, and gender disinformation campaigns that were very politically motivated. So in reality, were truly aimed at silencing them, at disqualifying them from the political life. And at the same time, talking to so many young women all over the world, I kept hearing how, in fact, digital media started representing the #1 disincentive for them to consider a political career, because they were truly concerned about how images that they might have posted online could be used against them or even invented against them. Fake stories could be invented against them. So we started researching gender disinformation and are now about to publish a new in-depth research of the patterns, motives, and modus operandi of gender disinformation in 5 countries around the world: Italy, Hungary, Brazil, Tunisia, and India. And there are 5 takeaways that we have definitely seen. Number 1, gender disinformation in particular, so those fake stories, photomontage, fake images are pervasive in every country. They are really politically motivated and they have a huge impact on the women in politics themselves and their families. Number 2, most often we see those gender disinformation campaigns actually being an early warning of 2 other dynamics being at play. The other dynamics are the undermining of women's rights and the undermining of democratic institutions by illiberal actors or authoritarian leaders, because we know that women are very often at the forefront of the fight for human rights and women's rights and democracy in very many countries, and so silencing them is a way of, in fact, undermining political opposition. As the UN says, women's rights are the litmus test for human rights, and I would say for democracy too. In this context, we have seen also that gender disinformation is being used as a tactic by some countries to exercise foreign influence in different elections. And we have seen some countries being particularly active on that. Third takeaway, women from marginalized backgrounds are most targeted. Black women, women of religious minorities, women of sexual minorities are targeted in a way that's overwhelming, that's particularly vicious. It makes it really hard for other women of those same groups to then become the number 2 and the number 3, as Silvana was mentioning, and really break this, this enormous concrete wall that they are facing. Another takeaway, and that's a very important one, social media platforms have a huge role to play in the status quo. The truth is that this isn't happening by chance, but by design, because of algorithmic preferences that are prioritizing engagement, no matter if fake, no matter if inauthentic, no matter if vicious, over safety, over human rights and social cohesion. And lastly, there is a lot that can be done, but I will leave that for a next round of questions.
Well done, thank you very much. It sounds to me from my experience that what's happening online is just an extension of what has happened to women in the past. As somebody who has had somebody who has followed me and talked to me for a long time, the police visited him, the special branch when I was a cabinet minister visited him, and this may sound funny, but the only way I got him to stop, I contacted his mammy. That actually worked. But it's not funny either when you're the subject of it. And it's not just people, it's also the media, which leads me into our next round of questions, because we need government action, we need civil society to engage in this, we need the media to engage in this, and to tackle all of the issues that we have just talked about here. So I want to just address that for the 10 minutes or so that we have left. So I'm going to ask you to be quite pithy and short, please. And I'm going to start with you, Silvana. And again, let's be practical. What are the effective measures that could really work in your experience?
Well, I think quick wins we can only do, and we're talking about OECD countries, I think mainly, is if we rethink party politics. Party politics are usually defining politics, and political parties are relatively closed shops. So we need to open them, and we need to really proactively involve women. Trudeau has done this in Canada, Macron has done this in France, really doing scoping exercises. Who are leaders, for example, in environmental issues or in educational issues, where you would classically find women who want to take responsibility for what's going on in their communities, and invite them to become candidates. So not wait for women coming, but go out and proactively approach women, and by this begin to open those political parties. We have had discussions many times in our own conferences about political parties. Are they allies or are they foes for women? And the tendency was seeing them not necessarily as allies. So breaking up the closed shop characteristic of party politics, I think is an important one. And then just a very short second one, I think open discussions about that women share their experiences, not only to other women, but very publicly, openly, and have men also championing the voices of saying that this needs to be changed, that this is not okay. If it's online violence, if it's description of women, if it's sexism in discourse, that we have a very open address of this. I think that would also be quite effective. Thank you.
Thank you, Silvana. I think sharing the experiences, and tell me what person does not like an invitation. So an invitation to join, to run, I think is something very positive. Lucina, you told us you have something else you wanted to share, so go ahead.
Yes, I think when it comes in particular to gender disinformation, online harms against women in politics, regulations and policies, digital platform standards are the key. The truth is that we're not going to get out of this issue only with, say, digital literacy. The problem is running much faster than that. We need to work on better standards that hold platforms accountable for what their products do in the world, for the harm that those products caused. And so looking at transparency of digital platforms and accountability. I think that those two principles are absolutely essential if we want to continue guaranteeing freedom of expression for women, minorities, and all those people that ever more feel threatened online and they feel they truly are not able to speak out online. So democratic countries have an ever more important role to play in really role modeling legislation that holds platforms accountable in those two ways.
Thank you, Lucina. Paulina, Lucina talked there about the platforms. What can governments and civil society do to counteract that disinformation?
Oh, thanks. I couldn't agree with Lucina more, because what we need is a holistic approach and strategies, in particularly information structures and sociocultural systems of each country. These strategies should have a preventive focus, be based on evidence, and prioritize policy reforms with an intersectional feminist approach. Governments cannot be afraid of regulating social media. This is also protecting fundamental rights of freedom of speech and expression. We need a multidimensional approach to get closer to resolve this issue, and that includes education, prevention, capacity building, dialogue with social media platforms, and policy reform and regulation. With this, it's very important for governments to recognize the need to protect the right to live free from violence in all digital platforms as a fundamental right. As a good practice, we can mention that the former draft of the Constitution in Chile that established that all people have the right to participate in digital space free of violence, which actually mentioned that the state will have to develop preventing actions, promote, repair, and guarantee this right, granting special protection to women, girls, boys, young people, and gender-based citizens. Based on this recognition, legal standards should be put in place to protect women's political leadership, as well as other educational and preventive mechanisms to educate the public about this issue. And here, let me mention the cases of Peru and Bolivia, where the definition of disinformation includes the dissemination of fake news against women in public life as a gender-based political violence with the aim of discriminating women. And this is a very important definition that we need to move forward. Another significant reform that I'd like to mention should be the implementing regulations on social media platforms. For example, the Digital Service Act, which retains the cornerstone of free speech protection, establishes a wide-ranging transparency obligations on internet, intermediates and online platforms, requires online platforms to put in place an internal complaints mechanism and provide statements of reasons for their decision. As Lucina mentioned, we need transparency in a bunch of different areas related to social media, but I'd like to mention particularly, for example, the lack of commitments to tackling disinformation at the corporate level, and how governments could get involved in dialoguing with social media on this, the lack of transparency around who is setting the agenda internally within tech companies, how changes are decided or designed, who has been involved or consulted, also the lack of representation from the Global South in the strategies developed by social media companies, the issue of products and policies that lack guidance from external specialists, the fact that platforms are not investing in working in communities to improve digital literacy of awareness, and finally, the request that tech companies have an open API to allow for civil society entrepreneurs to create solutions to this information, which at this point is not possible because of the high cost. So opening the dialogue and talking directly with social media platforms, I think, is one of the best measures that governments can and civil society can take.
I'm so glad all of that has been recorded, because you managed to throw so much into it. Also, I think it's important that we mentioned Iran and Afghanistan and Peru and Bolivia. But Nicole, if I come to you, our focus really is on OECD and OECD countries. And I'm just wondering, how can the OECD gender community work together to close all these gaps?
Thank you for that question. I think the question of inclusivity and addressing these gaps is a very important one. As you know, the United States prioritizes the advancement of diversity and inclusion in all aspects of society, including the economy, public and political life, basically every facet, right? In fact, in June of last year, of 2021, our president issued an executive order to promote diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility across our federal government, which of course is our nation's largest employer, including by prioritizing efforts to close gender and racial wage gaps, address workplace safety and harassment, including in our national security workforce, and advance equity for LGBTQI+ civil servants. Diversity and inclusion is, in fact, such an important issue that our national strategy on gender equity and equality and the underlying strategies adjacent to it commit to taking an intersectional approach that addresses the impact of intersectional discrimination and bias based on race, gender, and other factors, including sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, sex characteristics, ethnicity, religion, disability, age, and socioeconomic status. So again, we ask the question, what can we do? How can we address this? The OECD gender community can work together to close these persistent gaps by improving data collection to include sex disaggregated and gender disaggregated data to better measure the impact of policies. This includes gathering data around gender-based violence, including online harassment and abuse, which we've heard is such an issue, and it is definitely a major barrier to women's political participation. Fundamentally, We cannot talk about women's full participation in public life or advancing democracy if women and girls on the front lines of this effort are targets of gender-based online harassment and abuse, including disinformation campaigns. These acts have a chilling effect on women's political and civic participation and can lower the ambitions of adolescent girls who experience or witness technology-facilitated gender-based violence. The OECD can also develop core gender impact indicators for benchmarking and measuring progress. These indicators could help us to understand the impact of government initiatives and support comparative analysis to foster the implementation of OECD gender recommendations. The OECD could also establish an online platform, which could represent a key instrument to systemically collect, categorize, analyze, and share best practices on inclusiveness, gender equality, and gender mainstreaming. This one-stop gender knowledge shop could serve as an online hub to coordinate among public institutions, promote gender mainstreaming, and provide recommendations for innovative, targeted policies and programming. And of course, as we all sit here today, we know that the OECD could do what it does best, which is to convene international experts, as called for in the 2022 MCM statement, through an OECD forum on inclusiveness, gender, and economic resilience to strengthen the coherence and impact of the OECD's work in these areas. We need to redouble our efforts to address the barriers to women's democratic representation and political participation around the world. Now more than ever, we need the leadership, creativity, and determination of women and girls to catalyze change and help solve the global challenges we face. And the OECD has a critical role to play in that. Thank you.
Thank you for all those very practical things. I hope the OECD is listening. Yes, Tatiana tells me they're taking notes, but I mean, you're right, the OECD is uniquely positioned to do a total gender strategy right across all of the different sectors that it's involved in. The OECD deals with the green transition and economics and democracy and the digital world and gender strategy, and they shouldn't all be siloed and they shouldn't all be separate. But by bringing all of those together, that I think they can play a really important role in the whole progression of women's participation. And we look forward to seeing an OECD-wide gender strategy, which we will all be happy to participate in. Maya, can I come back to you in Egypt? Thank you for being with us. You addressed in your opening comments the whole area of the online abuse and that which became such a key part of our debate. Can I just ask you briefly, if I may, just the other issues that you think national and international leaders can tackle to help increase women's empowerment in public life, really tackling stereotypes and that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was really interested to hear all the comments regarding the cyber bullying, and I have also an experience that it's not only affecting the women in the position, but it's affecting the whole family. And what we noticed here is that you can do a lot of legislations. You can have women everywhere. You can rake the glass ceiling or shatter the iron walls, but the problem is the perception on the ground. And one tweet can have a destruction of a whole figure in the politics. And I heard someone talking about her child or her girl child, seeing a role model of her mother being destroyed, just being reputational hazards or something like this. And my suggestion to OECD, being the convention that is in the process of being submitted to other countries. And I think having OECD championing this agenda that has not been tackled before is the right moment with the right crowd. And what we have to aim is that, yes, platforms has to have the regulations, and if you read the regulations and the ethical codes of the regulations, you will laugh. Actually, they can remove a tweet or they can remove a post if you are assembled being a piece of furniture. But if you are attacked as a policymaker, or if your family is attacked, or your son or daughter is attacked, it is not a rights thing or that's something that could be removed from the Twitter or from the Facebook or from any social platform. I think there has to be a no harm policy. It's whatever, you can comment on my policies, you can comment on my strategies, you can attack me in the field that I'm working in, but you should not go to my family and you should not attack my family. This is my privacy and this is my personal life. That should not be used as a tool on the platform. So I think we have to go international. We have to influence the international convention that is undergoing studies right now with UNODC. And I think we have to push for a no harm policy with all social platforms. And I think also governments should not be afraid from putting regulation that would protect the women leadership or their leaders and parliamentarians from any attacks on social media if it's related to my private life, not my policies. Freedom of speech and freedom of expression and being an opposition, I respect this totally, but don't enter into my private sphere. My private sphere and my family is my family. Don't attack me as a woman. Attack my policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maya, and thank you for that very important message, which we should never lose sight of. Thank you. And the first shall be last. Bjarni, at the beginning you gave us very practical examples of role models and legislation that you had introduced. Now, obviously, we need that to be sustained. And you must have, I'm sure, overcome problems and difficulties as you got there, or how are you going to sustain the progress you have made? What lessons can we learn from you, please?
Yes, that's very true. We need to continue to develop, and let me reiterate what I earlier said, that we don't feel that we've come the full length. You know, we're still working on the issues, and we've prioritized them in our coalition agreement. And as was mentioned by Silvana earlier, these matters are headed by the Prime Minister. So what I think has been very useful lately, and we've been working on, is working on statistics, having better numbers in our hands. And let me share with you one website you could look up, which is IcelandiCincome.is, which is basically based on all tax statements by individuals since 1991, and this is then broken down into genders and income decimals and so forth. And there is a gender dimension on that website, and it's available in English, IcelandiCincome.is. We also work with the Statistics Iceland on where we stand in terms of the gender gap, salary gap, and what we can do about that. We work very closely with the labour market on that. Currently, we are going further into work-life balance issues, and we are shortening the work week, moving towards a 32-hour work week, which seems to be a huge gender issue, not least because in the health sector we have proportionally higher number of women working there, and many of them are working shifts, which is affecting their work-life balance heavier than men. We have introduced gender budgeting. Gender mainstreaming has been mentioned. So whenever a new proposal is being introduced which will lead to more expenditure, we do take one round of looking at how that new expenditure will affect the genders. Of course, increased education on all levels is fundamental for anything that you want to do. And lately, what we've seen, where we've seen good progress, is based on our 2010 law on equal representation on private company boards. We are finally seeing some movement happening there. So it's, once you've achieved some of your initial goals, then you have to continue, and you have to adapt to what society is asking for, and you need to be a little flexible. And what I like to do is look at the numbers, look at the statistics, and put an effort to make sure that you have the what you're doing is not only based on a feeling, but also on the numbers and what, for example, tax returns are telling you. And that's where we are at the moment. Of course, we are also working on issues that have been mentioned. Gender-based violence is a priority issue for the new government, but also what has been said on the social media, which is a big discussion issue in itself, and a very complicated issue. I'm not going to go very deep into that here and now, but thank you for having me today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Minister. Role models, legislation, data, education, economics, budgeting, online, offline, national, international. We've had it all here in the space of an hour, and I do apologise to our in-person audience who didn't get the opportunity to ask questions. I think all it does prove is that when you have a panel as stunning as I have had here, as international and as interesting and as experienced and with so much to say, please OECD give us more time the next time, because it's such a wonderful panel. So my sincere thanks, and I started with an Irish poet and I'm going to finish with an Irish poet, this time a female one, who wrote a poem to celebrate universal suffrage in Ireland, the centenary of it. That came in 1918, when women originally got the vote. So in 2018, she wrote a poem, and it's entitled, think about it, Our Future Will Become the Past of Other Women. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. It's a privilege to be with you all, as usual. Thank you very much.
And now we are invited to go back to the plenary, please. And we can grab a cup of coffee on the way.